Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Charity People Matters webinar. So I'm Rebecca Pallett, and I'm joined by my colleague Pili Fernandez-Mahoney, who you can also see. If you'd like to put any questions you have in the question and answer box as we go along, we'll do our best to answer those. If we don't have time for all of them, then it's best if you don't anonymize them, because that means that we can follow up with you later. There'll be a recording that's available afterwards, and you're welcome to send that on to any of your colleagues who might be interested. And if you want to know anything more about what we say today, or you've got a particular issue, then you're very welcome to get in touch with either me or Pili, and our contact details are at the end of the slide deck, which will be circulated. And then finally, if you've got time to give us some feedback after the session, that would be really helpful, and we'd be very grateful because it helps us to identify things like topics for future sessions. Okay, so what we're going to cover today. So this morning, we're going to talk about social media, and particularly the new Charity Commission guidance on social media. So first of all, we're going to look at the key risks involved in your staff using social media. We're then going to look at the new guidance that's come from the Charity Commission and how that will impact on you. We're going to look at a charity's social media policy and the sorts of things that contains. We'll then look at misconduct when it arises in the context of social media, and what might amount to misconduct, and something that you might dismiss for, and what doesn't. And then very briefly, we'll look at some things to consider in terms of monitoring staff usage, so considerations there, and some general practical pointers and tips. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at how employees use social media, and I'm going to hand over to Pili to do that.
Hi everyone. So the immense growth in popularity of social media in recent years have created very real opportunities for charities, but unfortunately at the same time legal liabilities can arise from the use of social media by employees, whether that be for work or personal purposes. It's increasingly important, therefore, for charities to understand, firstly, how this can happen, and secondly, how it can prevent problems from arising in the first place. So what are the ways in which your employees will use social media? So the first is in a work context. So, for example, you might have staff who are in charge of the charity's social media pages. So there might be people who are responsible for keeping Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, up to date, for example. That might be how they use them. Another example is where they represent themselves in a professional capacity. So you will have seen at the beginning of the presentation, both mine and Becky's QR codes, which take you to our LinkedIn pages, for example. That's quite common. Employees may also use social media in a personal capacity. And I think there are people who still don't use social media, but the vast majority of people do. They might have their own Facebook, they might have their own Instagram. Now, these posts that they post on these platforms, they might relate to their personal lives, or those posts might relate to work. They may talk about work, they may talk about colleagues, they might even talk about work-related issues on those platforms. They could even post photographs that are work-related, including of the workplace. So you can see there how the sort of work and personal life might blur when it comes to social media. So in terms of the key risks, I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. What are those key risks for a charity when we're talking about social media? What should we as a charity be concerned about? So there's the risk that what is being posted by your staff, whether that be for a work-related reason or not, is inconsistent with the charity's purpose. And you can see how that might pose a problem that you're going to have to deal with. There's also a risk of damage to the charity's reputation as a result of sharing that information as well. Depends on what's being shared. There's also the potential that what is shared was actually confidential in the first place and should have remained so, and therefore shouldn't have been something that's been posted on social media in the first place. There's also the potential that what is shared or a statement that might be made is discriminatory and potentially constitutes harassment, for example. And also, depending on what's included, there could be a risk of data protection breach as well. And let's not forget, with a general election expected in 2025, there's a potential that a post may be inconsistent with the restrictions on charities campaigning. And let's remember, charities are free to campaign robustly in furtherance of their purposes, but charities cannot support or campaign for any individual candidate or political party. And our motto at M&R for our charities clients is policies, not parties, when it comes to politics. So from an employment law perspective, if any of the issues I've just mentioned occur, then the approach that should be taken is to treat the online behaviour in the same way as you treat it offline. And what do I mean by that? Well, if someone's accused of bullying or misconduct, for example, online, then what you have to do is treat it in the same way as if there's been an allegation of bullying or harassment or misconduct in the workplace. And that's the real key point when it comes to social media. The Charity Commission have really helpfully released guidance on charities and social media, and this was published in September 2023. I have to say, it's really reader friendly. It makes some really good points, and it is one of those guidance documents which has really taken into account what people had been saying in the first place as part of the consultation that preceded it. It is a good read. And I do think it's really a worthy document to have a look at, how you might address issues with social media, but also how you might deal with issues, and also in particular, how you might go about considering what the charity's actual position is when it comes to social media. So I'll now go on to some areas of focus. And what I'm going to do is pull out some of the key points in the guidance and talk around those for you. So from a practical point of view, the guidance clearly recommends that charities have a social media policy when they themselves use social media. And I think that's clearly right. But beyond that, given so many people engage in social media on a personal level, and the fact that the line can sometimes be blurred between work and personal life when it comes to social media, it's definitely advisable that a charity has a policy, whether it uses social media itself or not. And that policy, it needs to be very comprehensive, but it needs to deal with all the issues around social media, and we'll go on to discuss what those all are. It's important that policy, or a slightly separate document, so you might have a social media policy for work-related purposes and one for personal use. There should be real guidelines on what that usage is, and that's probably one of the key points that we'll look at today. Again, any policy should be reviewed regularly. I know that's really easy to say, but I think particularly given social media is an area which advances and changes all the time, this policy in particular should be one of those that's on your list to review fairly regularly to make sure it's up to date. And I think it's a good point to make that if something does go wrong, then that's also an opportunity to review your social media policies as well. Because you want to see whether they do stand up and robust enough to deal with problems when they occur. And I think charities need to have a plan of action when things do go wrong. We see disastrous PR stories in the press, what feels like daily, to be honest, where the reputation of an organisation can be severely damaged as a result. What happens if tomorrow it happens to your charity? Who would deal with it? How are they going to deal with it? And what assistance do you require? Do you need some employment input, for example, from a legal point of view? Do you need some reputation management from a legal point of view? Are those the things that you need to be thinking about? Have you got a plan should something happen? Charities can often find themselves engaging with the public via social media on quite emotive topics. And a charity needs to have a plan as how it's going to engage on these particular topics. And there is Charity Commission guidance on what a motive is and how this should be handled. And also where charities use social media to engage in campaigning and political activities, I've alluded to before, there is useful information in the guidance, including links to rules and specific information around general elections, which I think you find quite helpful. And similarly, if a charity uses social media to carry out fundraising, for example, there's also some really useful information in the Charities Commission guidance as well. So I'm now going to focus on what a social media policy should cover. Now, the Charities Commission have developed a checklist for developing a social media policy. I think it's really helpful. It really does focus the mind on what the policy should cover. There's nothing worse than starting out with a blank page when you need to draft a policy. So I'd really recommend that you have a look at this checklist. If you have a social media policy already and you're not starting from scratch, then it's probably quite useful to use this checklist to just double check that you've covered all the key points. And those key points in the checklist, they are all also covered in the guidance, so you can use the two documents together. So I'm going to go through the areas referred to, and I'm going to pull out some of the examples, for example. So I'll go through these, and I'll start with how your charity will use social media. So what are your objectives when it comes to social media? What are you trying to do? That might be overlooked, for example, when you're doing a social media policy, but it's worth thinking about right from the start. What are our objectives here? What do we want to achieve? And that will hopefully then follow through then as you go through and draft your policy. What platforms are you going to use? I mean, these seem to change quite frequently. Again, a reason why you need to keep it under review, but consider what you're going to be using. And how, as a charity, are you going to moderate what is posted on social media, particularly by third parties who might post on your Facebook or your Instagram, for example? Think about what your oversight and controls around who uses social media on your charity's behalf and what that should look like. Who's going to have access to the Facebook account, for example, for your charity? What can they do? And who, will someone be posting daily, for example? Is that what the expectation is? Is that our objective, that someone will be posting daily? Those are the kind of things that you need to think about. And these are the kind of things you can put in your social media policy. Also think about how the charity expects people who manage the social media accounts to conduct themselves as well. What are those rules of conduct? What are your expectations of people? How will staff and also volunteers know what those expectations are? Are you going to roll out training? Are you going to make sure they consider the policies on a regular basis, for example? Have a think about those practicalities. And also, let's not forget, this social media policy will interact with other policies. So how is that going to happen? Are you going to have a separate policy for personal use of social media, as I've mentioned previously? How will it interact with your safeguarding policy, your whistleblowing policy, and your disciplinary policy? And what are you going to do when you have a social media incident that you need to react to? Who is going to be able to delete the content? How are they going to do that? Who should be the first port of call when there is a social media incident? Do the issues need to be reported to the full trustee board? At what point should that be happening? Is this an incident which is reportable to the Charities Commission, the police, or another regulator? Those are the kind of practicalities which, when something happens, you'll be very grateful that you have a social media policy that's already thought about all those different and quite important points. So I'm now going to go on to managing employee use on social media. So in this slide, you'll see there's some headline points for managing their use. And I think the first one, and it's really important if you're going through, for example, a disciplinary process, is to be very clear on what is and is not acceptable. And this is why your policy is key. Any disciplinary action is likely to be misconduct or a dismissal, for example, for some other substantial reason. And that means that the usual principles of unfair dismissal will also apply. So if you're taking an employee through for example, a disciplinary process because of their use of social media, ideally you want to be able to refer back to what was considered acceptable and what was not, and how that particular behaviour fits within that context. It's also going to be helpful if you're going through that process to be able to refer back and confirm that the employee has actually read the relevant policy or procedures, and also that they've, for example, undertaken training as well. I think it's really important when you're dealing with an incident to really carefully consider the facts. It's important not to have a knee-jerk reaction when something happens on social media, to take a reasoned approach. If the post, for example, has been posted on an individual's personal social media account, you need to firstly consider how close that post is associated with the charity. And then there's just a general reminder, really, that you do need to balance the impact of the charity and their objectives against the rights of the individual when you're pulling together what the charity's position on social media is, and then when you're dealing with it through a disciplinary process or other process, if there is a particular issue that has arisen. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Becky, and she's going to consider misconduct issues in the context of social media in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Pilly. Just before I do that, it's worth mentioning that we've had a very helpful comment. You mentioned that there is a template policy on the Charity Commission's website, which is really good. So thank you for that point worth making. Thank you. Okay, so look, we're going to look now at misconduct and the factors that you might consider when there is an issue with social media. I think sometimes it can be quite difficult to assess how bad something is when it's on social media and what the impacts and things might be. So I've just put some factors that you might consider on there. So you might first look at whether the conduct what's been written is against your IT or social media policies. Has that been made clear to employees? Are they clear about what their obligations might be? Have a look at the nature and the seriousness of the misuse. So you might be talking about how unpleasant or offensive something might be. It might be contrary to your values. There are all sorts of contexts in which you can look at the kind of nature and seriousness of something. Look at whether somebody's got previous warnings for similar misconduct. So, albeit that might come into play later in the process, it's worth knowing because you are obliged to look at kind of mitigating factors. So, there it might be that somebody's got a clean record, or it might be that somebody's had a warning for exactly the same sort of thing previously. One place where we see charities come unstuck, I think, with social media or dealing with disciplinaries that come out of social media issues is reputational damage. So there is a tendency, I think, to talk about reputational damage as kind of occurring simply because the post has happened and there is no necessarily evidence of damage or potential damage. And it's important that there is. So can you look at how posts like this previously have damaged the reputation of the charity? Have other charities been damaged by it? What is the actual or potential damage done, rather than what we see, as I say, quite frequently, which is an assumption that because there is an unpleasant post, there is damage, and the two don't necessarily follow. Have a look at whether it's from an individual's personal or work account. So is there any link to you as the employer? Was the post restricted simply to an audience of the individual's friends, or quite a close group? Look at whether the comments appear to have been made on your behalf as the employer. Sorry. Is it, could a member of the public interpreting it or reading it interpret it as being the view of the charity? If so, that's perhaps more serious than somebody who's patently not saying something on behalf of the charity. Look at where the activity is conducted from and when. So is it in work time, for instance? Has it been done from a work computer? Is it on a personal account? Is it on a work account? Those kinds of things can have an impact on how the misconduct is viewed. Has there been any impact on business and service delivery? And this again is a bit like the reputational damage issue. Don't make assumptions about that damage or that impact. But if there has been an impact, or you can see a potential impact, then that might make the misconduct more serious. Certainly consider the employee's position and their role. So the more senior that somebody is within an organisation, the more likely that it is that the public will see their views expressed on social media as representing the views of the organisation. And so again, that makes it perhaps more serious. Look at whether you can identify anybody or the employer, or it might be a service user or something like that from a post. It still makes my toes curl now, but I had a case a couple of years ago where somebody in an NHS trust had taken a photograph on a ward and then posted it to social media, which obviously enabled the service user and the patient and other staff to be identified. So if there is that kind of identification of people, then and that obviously makes it very much more serious. I've touched on kind of mitigating circumstances, but if somebody immediately puts their hands up and says, that wasn't very wise, I shouldn't have done it, I apologize, take it down immediately, that is a mitigating circumstance when you're looking perhaps at whether what sanction ought to be imposed. So what I'm going to do now is go through a few cases, just in terms of they're real life cases of misconduct relating to social media, and I'm going to take you through whether they were fair or unfair. So whether the conduct gave the employer the opportunity to dismiss. So was the decision to dismiss within the band of reasonable responses, and was the conduct complained of gross misconduct? So the first case is the case of Smith and British Waterways. So Mr. Smith worked for British Waterways and made the posts that are on the slide from his personal computer. So he said and he needs to learn to punctuate in the first instance, but that's why I hate my work. For those reasons, it's not the work, it's the people who ruin it, nasty, horrible human beings. And then I'm on standby tonight, so going to get half pissed, lol. Eloquent gentleman. Anyway, the first post was discovered not long after it had happened, but the second post was found 2 years later. So when the investigation was done, this post from 2 years previously was found. The employer's policy specifically banned action which might embarrass or discredit the employer. So Mr. Smith was then dismissed without notice for gross misconduct. And the question is, was that a fair or an unfair dismissal? Unfortunately, I can't ask for a vote, but you take a couple of seconds to think about that. And then if we have the next slide, please. So the tribunal did find that in the circumstances that was a fair dismissal, and it fell within the band of responses open to a reasonable employer. Interestingly, the tribunal found that it didn't matter that 2 years had passed from when that post about getting drunk had been posted and when it had been discovered. The claimant had tried to argue that he'd just been engaging in banter and had not actually been drinking, but the tribunal said that didn't matter. He'd presented it as though he was, which had had the potential to bring the charity into disrepute. So it found that the decision to dismiss was within the band of reasonable responses because his actions had undermined trust and confidence. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. So the second is the case of Mrs. Whittam and Club 24. So Mrs. Whittam was a team leader for Club 24. And Club 24 provided customer services to Skoda, which is part of the Volkswagen group. So Mrs. Whittam posted this comment on Facebook. She said, "I think I work in a nursery and I don't mean working with plants." So she posted that on her Facebook page. It was her personal Facebook page, and she was connected to about 50 friends on that page. She had previously a clean disciplinary record, and when her manager told her that such posts were unacceptable, she apologised immediately and took the post down. The manager then commenced disciplinary proceedings against her, and she was also summarily dismissed. So was that fair or unfair? Could have the next slide, please. So that one, the tribunal, perhaps unsurprisingly, found was an unfair dismissal. So it was outside the band of responses open to a reasonable employer. So they shouldn't have dismissed for it. The tribunal found that the comments were relatively minor. So they said that they were aimed at working conditions rather than at her colleagues or anyone specifically. Quite crucially, they found that there was no evidence of damage to customer relationships. So Skoda hadn't been concerned when they found out about this post, and there was no evidence of any. There was no complaint from Skoda. There was no, backing out of the contract or anything like that. So no evidence of impact on that relationship. The audience which could have seen that post was very limited. So it was only her friends, and as I say, there were about 50 of them, and there was nothing linking her to the employer on her personal web page. And then the most important thing was that when deciding what sanction they should impose, Club 24 had failed to take account of the fact that Mrs. Whittam had an exemplary, clean disciplinary record, that she'd apologised immediately and done so in writing, and that she'd taken the post down as well. So probably unsurprisingly, that turned out to be an unfair dismissal. And then finally, I'm going to look at Mr. Laws and game retail. So Mr. Laws was employed by game retail, and he put that tweet on X, as it's now called. So this week I've mainly been driving to towns the arse end of nowhere, shut roads, sorry about this, and twats in caravans equals road rage and loads of fags smoked. So obviously offensive language, and when the investigation was done, it revealed that there were 28 more of these kinds of comments, and most of them contained obscene language and offensive stuff. None of it was related to work, so Mr. Laws wasn't complaining about the way that he was being treated at work. It was done on his personal account, and although he didn't have a huge number of followers, 65 of the game retail stores were following his account. So that's the sort of context of this tweet, and a disciplinary process was commenced, and again he was summarily dismissed. So was that fair or unfair? If we could have the next slide, please. So this was a funny one, I suppose. So the ET, the Employment Tribunal at first instance, found the decision to be unfair, so that he'd been unfairly dismissed. And the matter went to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. And quite unusually for them, they said that the dismissal they believed was actually potentially fair, and they remitted it to the Employment Tribunal for the Employment Tribunal at first instance to reconsider their decision in light of some considerations that the EAT identified. So I've put those things on the slide. So the employee hadn't made the account private. His followers were not restricted to social acquaintances. So as I say, it was followed by some of the stores, and he knew that he was followed by them. So there was the potential for staff to see what he'd written, and probably potential customers. And the employer was entitled to conclude that the tweets might have caused offence. So the kind of language, the kind of obscenities and things he was using, they were entitled to consider that that they would cause offence. So that was then remitted to the ET. So got two courts disagreeing with each other on that one. So if you didn't necessarily get the right answer, that's probably no surprise. All right. So if we could have the last or second to last slide. So just to flag, really, I don't want to say a great deal on this, and I'm conscious that we're at the time we should be finishing, but I just wanted to flag that when you're dealing with social media issues, you are inevitably dealing with data protection issues as well. So certainly worth taking advice on on the data protection elements. So, you can't screen when you're monitoring staff, you can't screen on a general basis. You have to notify them of your policy. And so on. And in terms of recruitment, there was a suggestion a few years ago that if you went into an interview, you should be sat down in front of a computer and made to log into your Facebook account so that your prospective employer could see what you're doing. That's unsurprisingly perhaps not acceptable. So don't assume that from a data protection perspective that you can inspect somebody's profile and pages and so on simply because they are open to the public. So for purposes of recruitment and so on, and be careful. The other flag is be careful with kind of protected characteristics and information in that context as well. So just really a flag. And then finally, just put a few practical tips on the final slide. So Pilly's talked about the importance of policies in setting out acceptable behaviours, and you can draw up some careful boundaries that are actually specific to your charity and what you're doing, and make them fit what you're doing. If there is a debate, as Pilly said, what did you say? Policies, not parties. So remain neutral in any debate if that's what's happening on social media. If there is a discussion about things and you as an employer want to post, then make sure that it's neutral. As Pilly said, if you've got something where you've got opposing views, make sure that you treat it as though you would if people were having this discussion in the office. Treat them consistently and fairly. There is a big training piece, I think, around managers understanding how to implement a policy. Those and particularly somebody that's dealing with a disciplinary process, particularly those things I'd put on the slide about misconduct and the sorts of things that ought to be taken into account, can be a really useful reference point for managers doing a disciplinary process. And then finally, it is worth thinking about taking legal advice before you dismiss. So as we've seen with those 3 cases, it can be quite difficult to tread that line between fair and unfair, and actually what is a reasonable response to what's happened. And certainly there's a massive body of case law on that we can help you navigate and come out on the right side of. We've got a couple of questions. We'll go through them, but obviously feel free to drop off if you haven't got the time. All right. Will the slides be shared afterwards? That's an easy one. Yes, they will, and there'll be a link sent round. When looking at behaviour on social media, is it fair to ask staff not to befriend volunteers? A lot of our regional team do this, and it's hard to control, but obviously it does come with a lot of risks. Yes, I mean that will be specific to your organisation, and if you think there is a risk to the organisation, or I don't know, a safeguarding issue or something like that, I don't see it as unreasonable as to include something in your policy that asks them not to ask volunteers to be associated with them on social media. That sounds fairly reasonable to me. Right. So, and then the other one is the webinar going to be recorded to access later? So yes, it will be, and again that link will be sent round. All right. Well, I think that covers everything. So it's nice to see you all. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you again soon.